Then the next visit was to Vogel, and he said, well, the first thing I've got to do is to find out whether any of these people are bearers of secrets who will not be allowed out under any circumstances.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 6, 9, 8, 8, 3.
This is Radio Star Czechoslovakia, the legitimate voice of occupied Czechoslovakia.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
Colin Munro was the British Deputy Head of Mission in East Berlin from 1987 to 1990. Now I need you to concentrate for this next bit. The UK did not recognise East Berlin as part of the GDR. However, in 1973 it established an embassy to the GDR, not in the GDR, in East Berlin to provide a diplomatic presence. As Deputy Head of Mission, Colin was effectively the Deputy Ambassador and was responsible for improving trade, ensuring correct dealings on the status of Berlin, and to try and promote peaceful change. Do you know how much $3 is in UK pounds? It's 76 pence, which equals about 20 pence or 75 cents per episode if you sign up as a monthly financial supporter of the podcast. Higher amounts are welcome too. It's very straightforward and you can stop whenever you want. Plus, monthly supporters get the sought-after Cold War Conversations coaster too. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. Thank you so much to our generous financial supporters who help to keep us on the air. Back to today's episode, Colin tells of life in the embassy with some fascinating insights into the unique difficulties of being a diplomat in a capital city that the UK did not recognise. We welcome Colin to our Cold War conversation.
After I'd finished in Romania, I was back in the FCO's Western European department. And this had originally been the German department, and we dealt with both German states and Berlin, and a little bit of what was called Berlinology. Our standpoint was that Germany was divided into two states, which we recognized as states, but the Germany within its frontiers of 1937 continued to exist, and the four victorious powers, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the US, had continuing responsibilities for Berlin and Germany as a whole. Berlin, in our view, was still divided into four sectors. And so East Berlin was not the capital of the GDR. We had no view on what the capital of the GDR was. We had our embassy in East Berlin, but it was the embassy to the GDR in East Berlin. And we refused to deal with any East German entities such as the Ministry of Defense, which were in flagrant contradiction of the demilitarized status, as far as Germans were concerned, of the city. And the Russians had gone along with this in an agreement, or at least with some of this, in an agreement in 1971, which was in fact the basis of West Germany's Ostpolitik. The city had been divided by the wall in 1961, and this agreement of 1971 between the four powers regulated a sort of modus vivendi in the city, which diffused it as a source of international tension, allowed cooperation between East and West Germany, and did not affect what were known as quadripartite rights and responsibilities. And the Russians were interested in these as well because they maintained the main Soviet war memorial was in the British sector of Berlin, and the Russians exercised their right to travel around West Berlin and indeed around West Germany. All the four powers had military missions to each other's forces. Ours was called BRIXMIS, and they all had a headquarters in Potsdam, and they were accredited to the Soviet armed forces. And it was basically a spying operation, and the Russians were doing the same in West Germany. Anyway, all this infrastructure continued. But in West Berlin, of course, the occupying powers had become so-called protecting powers. And this whole structure meant that the German question was still open in international law. And it was the responsibility of the Foreign Office's Western European Department to see that that all the intricate details of these necessary to maintain this status, such as not allowing your passport to be stamped by East Germans in East Berlin, was maintained. And so I had this responsibility for several years in London, and then as number 2 in the embassy in East Berlin, I really had 3 main tasks: improve our modest trade with East Germany, see that we were correct in our dealings with the East German authorities on the whole status issues, which were to be handled by the British military government in West Berlin with the Russians and not by us, and of course tried to promote peaceful evolutionary change and also keep the embassy running. We had, when I arrived, we had an ambassador who was a sort of brilliant trade negotiator and deal maker, but was not really too familiar with Kremlinology. So I had quite a sort of a challenging upward management role. That all changed when he retired and was replaced by one of our most brilliant Sovietologists who just died recently, Nigel Broomfield, a great friend of mine, who later became ambassador to the United Germany. The first thing that happened after I arrived was that Honecker at last got to make a visit that he had been aspiring to make for many years, and that was a quasi-state visit to West Germany. And this took place in September 1987, and it was a most extraordinary affair. The West Germans greeted him with all possible honors. In some ways, they gave him more honors than would have been accorded to any other state visitor. He went to his place of his birth in the Saarland. The West Germans got one concession out of him, and that was that there could be a vast increase in the number of people below pensionable age who were allowed to visit West Germany on so-called Familienangelegenheiten, sort of family matters. And so if it was your auntie's birthday, you could apply to go. Of course, the East Germans, I remember vividly, our neighbor's mother was allowed to go to West Germany, and the 7-year-old said, "I want to go with Mummy to see my auntie as well." The 9-year-old says, "Oh, you don't understand. We've got to say here is the deposit that Mummy comes back." And so you see, children knew it all. And the reaction, in the first year after this visit, about 1 million people made such visits. And the universal reaction was that this place, West Germany, it's much nicer than what we can see on television. That's a significant number of people. And of course, the West Germans went out, provided sort of funding for all this. I mean, it was extraordinary.
So they were getting, so, you know, that if you multiply that over a number of years, then you've got a significant proportion who have been exposed to the West and its seductive...
Yes, that's right. And not just pensioners, because the old joke, I mean, as usual in communist countries, you survive on the black humor, you know. What's the age of majority in East Germany? Answer, 65, because then you're allowed to travel.
Yeah. And in fact, the GDR didn't want the pensioners back either.
No, they wanted them to stay. The West Germans should pay for them. Absolutely. Yes, that's right. I had, this was in August 1988, and I was in charge of the ambassador was on leave. And we had a sit-in, you know, people were always sitting in the West German permanent representation and so on, and trying to force through their escape to West Germany. And so we had a sit-in in our embassy, 2 families, 16 people and 2 dogs. And I thought, especially because of the 2 dogs, this was probably a provocation. But it turned out not to be. And we had as our legal advisor the famous lawyer Vogel, who did all these negotiated these
the spy exchanges. Because was he the Bridge of Spies lawyer?
Yes, he did the Gary Powers. That was how he got started. Yes, you're right. Anyway, I told my staff not to be too friendly to them, but of course with dogs and kids it was just impossible. There was soon something like a party going on down in our reception area, which we had to close. Anyway, I went round to the West Germans and gave them the list of names, and I saw the chap who was in charge of all this, the number 2 for the ministry. He was from the Ministry of Inter-German Affairs, and he looked at it. He said, "Mr. Munro, this is going to cost us an awful lot of money, you see, to get these people sorted out."
Yeah, because at that point the East Germans were charging, weren't they, for anybody who went over to the West?
It depended on your. More for a doctor than for a bricklayer. Yeah. And so then the next visit was to Vogel, and he said, well, the first thing I've got to do is to find out whether any of these people are bearers of secrets who will not be allowed out under any circumstances. So he did that, and he said, no, there are no Geheimnisträger, secret bearers there. He said, your job is to persuade them that they cannot leave your embassy and go and trot over to Checkpoint Charlie. They are going to have to go back home, and then we will negotiate, and eventually you can have my word for it, they'll get out. So I had to start trying to persuade these people that was the case, and they were deeply suspicious, and I could see that they didn't trust me and all the rest of it. And I said to Vogel, I think you're going to have to come and talk to them yourself. And he said, that is absolutely the last resort, because if I do this for one group, I'll have to do it for every group, and we'll never finish. And so negotiations went on for days and days, and eventually I did persuade them that we would visit them. They came from Thuringia. We would visit them, we would keep an eye on their fate, and we would ensure no bad things happened to them.
Right.
And so that was August 1988. They got out in June 1989.
Wow. Yeah.
And just as I was engaged in this negotiations, there was a sit-in at the Danish embassy. And the reason why there was a sit-in there was because people had found out that the Danish Prime Minister was due in town. And the Danish ambassador made a most horrendous mistake. He authorized the Volkspolizei to clear his embassy because he didn't want a bunch of asylum seekers spoiling his prime ministerial visit. And his staff and the rest of us, we begged him not to do this, but he did. And eventually of course, it all happened at a weekend when there was nobody to consult available in Denmark. They were all on the beaches. Yeah. And this was this colossal error of judgment. He was humiliated. He had to leave the Foreign Service and died shortly thereafter.
Wow. But that is incredible that he thought that was a viable option. I mean, inviting East Germans onto their territory.
Well, you see, your embassy is your sovereign territory.
Yeah.
But as it's your sovereign territory, you're the sovereign, and you have the right, and if you have the, so for example, if the place catches fire, you have the right. You authorize the local fire brigade to put it out.
Yeah, I guess there is that. Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, the East Germans themselves, they were amazed. They said, "You really want us to do this?"
Yeah, they probably thought it was a trick to start with. So this was quite regularly. Was this quite regularly happening in other NATO embassies then? People sort of coming in?
No, mainly the West German one.
Right. Okay.
In fact, they had an annex of their. The West Germans didn't have an embassy because they said it was not a foreign country.
Yeah.
So they had what was called the permanent representation.
Right.
Die DDR ist ein Staat, aber ist nicht Ausland. So that takes us into 1989.
Can I just ask a few other questions? Because you mentioned trade. What trade was the UK having with the GDR?
Well, we had with the GDR, as with all the communist countries, we had a trade was conducted via a so-called joint commission. On our side, it consisted of government representatives, Foreign Office, Department of Trade and Industry, maybe the Bank of England, maybe the Department of Energy, and also representatives of firms that were doing business with the GDR.
Yeah.
And I suppose the firm that did the most business with the GDR was ICI, which had a very profitable line in trade in bulk chemicals, for which the East Germany produced competitive prices at enormous environmental cost. And what we were trying to do was a big contract which would, as it were, raise the level to the trade level to new dimensions. And we were supporting a company which is, I think, long since gone out of business, called Davy McKee. And they had developed a process for cleaning up the emissions from power stations powered by lignite, brown coal, which is very dirty.
Yeah.
And the East Germans depended for an enormous part of their energy production on brown coal. And this was called a Rauch in German, a Rauchgasentschwefelungsanlage. And Davy McKee had won an environmental prize for such a facility, for such a power station in West Germany. So, and the East Germans said that they were willing to buy a power station, this desulfurization plant from Davy McKee, and so there were laborious negotiations, of course the embassy's job was to support Davy McKee, And in the case of East Germany, like with other communist countries, you had to go through sort of trade intermediaries. These were sort of brokers who took a cut. You could not deal directly with the East German enterprise in question. You had to deal with these rascals.
Yeah.
They took 10% basically for being the grit and the oyster. It was agreed that Davy McKee would provide this desulfurization plant, and they would build it, and it would be to their standards. But the East Germans insisted there's got to be sort of local content and from our production. And Davy McKee made what turned out to be a mistake. It was agreed that the instrumentation, which would measure what was going on, would be provided by the East Germans.
Right.
So the plant was built, and it didn't function properly. And the Davy McKee found that they were having to the metal was corroding, and in the end they had to line a whole masses of pipework with platinum.
Wow.
And after the fall of the wall, we found out what had been going on. The desulfurization plant worked on the on a specification that, say, 40% of the I've forgotten the exact figures now, but say 40% of what you were feeding into the power station to be burned was actually capable of producing energy. But what these Germans had been doing was filling it with gunge, and it was only had about 10% calorific value, and their instruments had all been rigged to say the contrary.
Yeah.
And so there was, so this was an example. And they, of course, were complaining that Davy McKee's plant was not up to standard and all the rest of it. And, you had a sort of a trade dispute.
Yeah, yeah.
But we had other, we had quite a reasonable machine tool business in those. Britain had a machine tool industry in those days. And there was printing machinery. And, and at one point, we were very successful. A British company supplied a plant for packing bread, sliced bread, best things than sliced bread in cellophane, in cellophane packs.
Yeah,
and this was a high-tech innovation. And they got a contract for packing sweets and goodness knows what. So with persistence and by identifying opportunities and then presenting, having firms at the Leipzig trade fairs and so on.
Yeah.
We were gradually making progress.
Right.
And we were doing all we were trying to build up our cultural exchange program and all the rest of it, and so we were quite busy, but it was fairly hard pounding.
Yeah, and importing stuff from the GDR. I mean, I'm aware of Praktika and some of the film they produced, the Orvo film.
I think you see Ilford. Do you remember Ilford cameras?
Yeah.
I think their film processing came from East Germany, Wolfen.
Right.
A place called Wolfen. And then for a time, Wartburgs were imported to the UK.
Yeah, somebody posted an ad or emailed me an advert for one.
Yes.
£700 you could buy it for.
Yes. And, MFI furniture. That was made in East Germany.
Right. Okay. I knew that IKEA had used East Germany. I wasn't aware of MFI.
Oh, yes, they did. MFI. It was nearly all from East Germany.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting.
We were at a disadvantage as compared with the West Germans, though, because the West Germans financed trade by means of a so-called swing credit. That was one thing. And then the other thing was that whenever an East German enterprise was on the brink of collapse for want of spare parts, they just got in touch with the brothers in West Germany who patched it up for them. And what is more, East German exports could be exported to West Germany without any customs dues. They had a backdoor, by a protocol to the Treaty of Rome, they had customs-free access to West Germany. The goods were not supposed to be exported onwards within the European Union, but who knows what happened. But in practice, East Germany was in a customs union with West Germany.
Oh, well, Theresa May could do with knowing that.
She could take some tips from them, yes.
Did you meet Honecker in person?
I didn't meet him in person to have a conversation with him. No, the ambassador, they were very, very protocolaire. And the ambassador they had, functions at which you could go and talk to members of the politburo and so on. And they used to have an annual shooting, hunting,
Oh, yeah, Honecker was very keen on that.
He was very keen on that,
yeah.
Yes. So the ambassador got to meet Honecker, but the number two didn't. But I met quite a few of the. I remember conversations with Axon, who was the Politburo member for Foreign Affairs. The system was, like in all communist countries, the real power was the Politburo. The government was basically executive organs. And so the foreign minister, for example, Oskar Fischer, he wasn't a member of the Politburo.
Right.
Gromyko in the Soviet Union was, but not Fischer. And we met quite senior people in the whole foreign trade apparatus. And then, we had a social security agreement with the East Germans, and I knew the Minister of Health. We had him on an official visit to Britain. And, and of course, contact with ordinary people was really, really actually quite easy. Much easier than in Romania. And there were people in certain professions. Of course, there were people who kept their distance because of, the whole security apparatus and all that. But, for example, medical doctors were in short supply, and they knew the East Germans couldn't possibly sort of, imprison them or make their life difficult. So you would have medical doctors who didn't care about bans on contact with Westerners and all the rest of it.
Right.
There were people. The Soviet bloc embassies had a completely different range of contacts, and I was quite lucky. I developed relations of real friendship with the Polish number two, and the Hungarian number two, and indeed the Romanian and the Czechs, and all these. The ambassadors were mostly apparatchiks who couldn't speak German and had been sent to East Berlin as a punishment posting. The Pole would say to me, "Why have we got this awful sod here?" Well, it's a punishment posting for him. Germany and the wrong sort of money.
Yeah. And did those number twos give you a sense of being in the reformist camp or still being hardline?
The Pole was reformist. The Hungarian was an ardent reformist. and he was actually one of my best sources. I'll come on to that in a minute.
Right.
In a minute. The Czech, as usual, was sitting on the fence, and the Romanian was shifty. The Yugoslav was also very good value, and these people meetings with on the party network, and could give you insights into what was really going on in the politburo. And then my best source, bar none, would you believe it, was an Ethiopian.
Right. Why was that?
This guy had worked for the BBC, and at this time, Ethiopia was being run by a Marxist dictatorship, Mengistu Haile Mariam, and so the Ethiopians had brotherly relations with the East Germans, who were very interested in Africa. And this guy had been kept on by the communists, although because he was a fluent German speaker, and so they needed him for the meetings.
Yeah.
And we used to sort of meet surreptitiously and talk over old times. And then when things began hotting up after June 1989, he would sort of the Ethiopians were alarmed about what was happening and sent party delegations. And my friend had to interpret for me, and he used to tell me what was going on. And he said there was one famous occasion. There was a trade union delegation from Ethiopia, and this was in August 1989. And the head of the trade union, it was called the Freie Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund. They had their offices next to our embassy, actually. And we said FDGB stood for die guten Beziehungen. And anyway, Harry Tisch, in his cups, had said, well, the Hungarians, by opening their frontier, they've put the kibosh on the GDR. It'll be gone within a year.
Right. Wow.
Because the wall had been built to prevent the state from imploding. The Hungarians had opened it, and so it would implode.
Yeah. And Harry Tisch was quite famous for his drinking.
That's right. Yeah, he was a drunkard. Yes.
Wow.
But in vino veritas, as it were.
Yeah. So even within the Politburo, they could see the writing on the wall with Hungary opening the border.
Well, sort of. The trouble was that they were. It was by this time it was a group of elderly men, and they were victims of their own propaganda, and they didn't know any way out because they regarded the Poles and the Hungarians were offside, and Gorbachev was betraying communism.
Yeah.
And so they wouldn't have perestroika in the GDR because if you had Gorbachev-type reforms, the whole question of the validity of the state would come up. And indeed, there was the SED and the SPD had started a sort of a dialogue, and in September 1989, when things were really hotting up, one of the SED's chief ideologues gave an interview to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and he said, without the communist ideology, there is no justification for the East German state.
That must have gone down well when that was published.
Well, I sent. This was after the Hungarians had opened their border. Because what happened was that the Hungarians had concluded a bilateral agreement with East Germany in 1969 that they would not allow, and all the communist countries had these agreements with each other, they would not allow tourists to cross their frontiers to the west.
Yeah.
And the Hungarians had dismantled their frontier fortifications and denounced the agreement.
Yeah.
And the Hungarian number two, as I told you, was a friend of mine, and he said, "Well, we've had it up to there with the East Germans. They're saying we know what communism is, because Marx was a German, and anyway, he admitted that the West Germans are paying us off."
Yeah, yeah, which was
switching sides.
Yeah, which was the absolutely the case. I think you mentioned that you had a meeting in Moscow in May '89.
Oh yes. I was participated in meetings of something called the Politische Club Berlin. This was a sort of a German-speaking think tank which had been founded, I think, in 1968 after the invasion of Czechoslovakia by a sort of an eccentric idealist who was actually born in Britain, but he'd fought in the just towards the end of the war and had escaped and all the rest. And he was on a one-man mission to promote friendly relations between East and West. And he founded the sort of talking shop that the Germans love, they had regular meetings on a sort of a Monday night in a West Berlin hotel, and then they had what they called Projekttagungen, and it was all under the auspices of the OSCE, you see, and so the West Berlin Senate had lots of money for what was called Berlin Förderung, so they put up money for this, and so. These meetings took place sometimes. There was a wonderful meeting in Italy in very lavish surroundings, and then I organized one in Edinburgh and got a lot of East Germans to attend, and you got people a few from East Germany, definitely from Poland, definitely from Hungary, very much fewer from Czechoslovakia, and lots of Russians who were keeping an eye on what was going on. And these people were from sort of institutes for economic affairs, and including what was called the Institute, a Moscow-based Institute for the Study of the World Socialist System, headed up by a guy called Bogomolov, and he had a representative in the Russian embassy Soviet embassy in East Berlin, became a friend of mine. And he said, well, this is turning into the Institute for the Study of the World Capitalist System, actually. And again, in the plenary sessions, things would be a bit sterile, but then during the coffee breaks and at the bar and everything, it was like this Madrid conference, only more so. And then anyway, a meeting was organized for May 1989 in Moscow, and the Russians agreed to host it. And I went to the meeting, but there'd been a pre-meeting tour to the Baltic states. I didn't go on that because we weren't allowed to go to the Baltic states because we didn't recognize their incorporation in the Soviet Union.
Right.
But anyway, the Western participants arrived in Moscow saying, well, the message here we're getting in places like Latvia is out of the Soviet Union into the European Union. That's what we want. And so discussions unfolded. As this meeting was going on, Gorbachev was just finishing his visit to China. And people were reporting that the Warsaw Pact would come to an end, and the division of Germany might be in question, and all the rest of it. And then on the second day of the conference, the Russian, the Soviet Foreign Ministry, which was a very hardliner, they sent in some of their most senior people who made thunderous statements that the division of Germany was the result of the Second World War and there would be no change. The Hungarians and the Poles were telling us in the coffee breaks, up to these guys, in time these guys are going to catch the tide of history, you'll see. So you could see that, and also it was very interesting being in Moscow in May 1989. It was beginning to be a bit like sort of Hyde Park Corner, but there was nothing in the shops.
Right.
The economic and the sort of provisioning crisis was evident for, even for a sort of superficial visitor to see.
Yeah.
So it was absolutely fascinating meeting. And then I went to see, I had some side meetings, and I went to see Mr. Bogomolov, and he said, tell me, Mr. Munro, is it really the British government's position that you would be in favor of the unification of Germany under certain conditions? And I said, well, yes, that's the position that we've been defending for 40 years. And Mr. Bogomolov said, well, I think your official position is it's somewhat hypocritical, because you don't actually think it's going to come about. And so I said, who can tell what will happen in 100 years? But as of now, our position is, as I've just stated it to you, and I reminded him of Article 7 of the Bonn-Paris Conventions, which we look forward to the day when Germany may be reunited and have under a liberal democratic constitution. And so we left it at that.
Right. And then in the next month you had the Solidarity election, and then
right.
Gorbachev's visit to West Germany.
There were really dramatic developments taking place around East Germany at that time. You had, in Hungary, you had not only the decision on dismantling the border with Austria, but also the Hungarian Revolution was no longer the sort of traitorous act and all the rest of it, and the multi-party system was coming into effect.
Yeah.
And in Poland, indeed, you had the Solidarity's victory at the elections. And at the same time, in June 1989, you had Gorbachev's visit to West Germany, and you also had the crackdown in Tiananmen Square on the Chinese democracy movement, which was praised by Egon Krenz as the way to deal with protesters.
Yes.
And so there were great fears later that year as to whether Krenz would impose a Chinese solution.
Right.
So the one, as it appeared at the time, sort of stable neighbor to the GDR was Czechoslovakia, which was still in the grip of the hardliners.
And we have further photos, videos and information on this episode in our show notes, which will show as a link in your podcast app. Now, this podcast would not exist without our generous Patreons, and I would like to especially thank our Politburo level members who contribute a generous $30 a month each to help keep us on the air. They are Tony Sowards, Sam Hardwick, Nicholas Butter, Jeffrey Jones, Matthew Comstock, Frederick Esposito and Peter Ryan. Don't forget, if you'd like to get one of those Cold War Conversations coasters, help keep us on the air, then head over to coldwarconversations.com/donate. If you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.